So in this particular chapter, I will talk to you about the need for aliases. Now to do that, I will start by adding my fetch trigger to my particular function. So let's do that. So let's go back to my versions again and let's click on the latest version. So this is my version 2. And let's add a trigger to this version. And I'll add the most commonly used trigger, and that is the HTTP API gateway, which creates an HTTP endpoint for this particular function. So I will create a new one. I'll click on create an API and it'll be just an HTTP API. Now let's not bother about the intricacies of this. All that it does is it just creates an HTTP endpoint for this particular function. So I click on add. So let's call this particular function too. So to do that, just click on this API gateway. What you get here is an API endpoint. So all that you need to do is you just need to copy this and let's just paste this. And you can see that you get the output. Now let's suppose that this particular version has changed and you created a version 3 for that, for this particular function. So let's do that. So I go back to my main function. And what I do is I'll create another version. So let's just create a version 3. I'll click on action. I'll publish a new version. I'll just call this as version 3 and I'll publish this. Okay, what I need to do is I need to deploy this. So I'll click on deploy, click on actions and publish new version. Again, I'll just call this as version 3. Click on publish. Okay, so now the issue is that if I have to access my version 3, I have to create another trigger and I have to update the front end or the piece of code that is calling this particular version so that it is able to access the latest version of this particular Lambda. Now that is an issue because the problem there is that for any new version that gets created, you need to create a new trigger and you need to update the front end for the same. Now to overcome that particular problem, we have something called as an alias. Now let's see how that works. So I go back to my function again. What I'll do is I click on an alias and I'll create an alias. So I'll just call this as my alias. You can just give a name for my alias, for your alias. The description is optional. And here you can give a version. So let's just choose the third version. So now what will happen is that I have created an alias and that alias will point to whatever version of that particular Lambda that you like. So I'll click on save. And you have created an alias and this particular alias is pointing to the latest version. And here the important thing is you can add a trigger and this trigger can again be an API gateway. So let's create a new trigger. So let's create an API. Again, this will be an open one. I'll click on add. So now this particular API endpoint, HTTP endpoint that I have created can point to whatever version that you like. So currently, if I open this particular endpoint, you can see it's pointing to version 3. Now I can change this manually as well. So if I go back to my alias again, so I'll click on my edit. And here, if I want this particular endpoint to point to version 2, I'll just change this to version 2 and click on save. And if I click on the same endpoint again, now you can see that it's pointing to version 2. And another very distinct advantage that this has is that you can have it as a weighted alias as well. So let's say I want half of my versions to be pointing to version 3 and the other half is pointing to version 2. So I will just change the weight to 50 here and 50 here. So half the request will go to version 2 and the other half will go to version 3 and I'll click on save. So if I go back to my endpoint and if I do a control F5, you can see that some of the endpoints are going to version 2 and the others are going to version 3. So now if I want to configure my front end, I just need to give this HTTP endpoint rather than giving new HTTP endpoints for new versions. So I hope this was a useful lecture and If you have any doubts about this, please get in touch with me and I'll gladly help you out. So I'll see you in the next chapter.